Hey everybody, today I am talking about Pachinko by Min Jin Lee. Pachinko is a book that was written by Min Jin Lee originally several years ago. She actually in the 80s took a class about Koreans and Korean Japanese living in Japan and how hard the struggle was over there. And so she started a story and she really wanted to tell it right. But unfortunately, the manuscript wasn't really getting anywhere. She also had called it Motherland at the time. And she really wanted to tell the story right, so it just wasn't picking up any traction. She ended up writing another book in the meantime, Free Food for Millionaires. Eventually she moved to Japan and she was able to actually meet a lot of Korean Japanese, and they were able to tell her firsthand stories of what their experience was during the war and after the war. And so that is where she actually was able to formulate the story and write the story that she really wanted to portray in Pachinko. So this book starts in 1910, goes all the way to 1989. That is a lot of time to cover, which is why this book is almost 500 pages. And also, when I was deciding to read this, since I knew how long it was, and I knew that there was going to be some terms in there that I wasn't familiar with in Korean or in Japanese, I really wanted to make sure I was getting this story. And so I actually took a 3x5 card and I wrote down all of the terms that I didn't know and looked up the translation, put them on there, so if it ever came up again, I would remember what it was and get the full context of the story, rather than just guessing what it must be. And that was really helpful for a lot of terms, because there are a lot of terms that you come across in here. And so that was helpful for me to do that and really stay into the story. So just a little bit about it. I don't want to go too far into it because for spoilers and things like that. And so since so much happens, I just feel like everything that happens is a spoiler. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the characters and my impression with it. So this story, since it starts all the way in 1910 and goes to 1989, we have a lot of characters. But I'm just going to talk about like the main characters, which is the family that this story is centered around. So we have a mom whose name is Young-jin, and she married a man named Hooney who had some defects. He had like a limp and his palate was cleft. He had a cleft palate. So this made it really hard for him to find a wife. Not very many people would want to marry him, because then what if the child gets that gene and things like that. And so Young-jin actually, though, she came over and she married him, and they tried to have a lot of children and it just wasn't working out for them. Eventually, though, they had a daughter that survived, and her name is Sunja. And I feel like Sunja is the main character of this story because it really centers around her family. So her mom, and then all the people that she interacts with, and then her children. So Sunja we first meet her when she's 16, and we get to really understand how she helps out around the house. They own a boarding house, and so she works, and she's a really hard worker, and this is just kind of how her life starts. She's just a really hard worker, helping her mom out, washing laundry of the people that are living at the boarding house, doing the food, and all those things. Then we have her husband, Isak, that she ends up marrying later, and he is someone that lived at the boarding house for a short time. He actually got really sick, and so he had to stay there, and they tended to him until he was nursed back to health, basically. And so they end up getting married, and so that's their relation. And then we have Yoseb and Hyungi, who are married, and that Yoseb is the brother of Isak. And so the two of them, they end up going to Osaka to live there because that's where Yoseb lives, and so Isak goes to live with them over there. And Hyungi is a loving wife that stays at home per Yoseb's request, wanted to have a family of her own but wasn't able to have children. So that's a little bit about them. Then we have, eventually later down the line, because there's several years that go through, we have Sunja having children, and she ends up having a son named Noah and a son named Mosatsu. Those two are also a big part of the story because they come in maybe in a little bit before the halfway point. And so there's a lot about them as well. And then we have some other characters that come later as well that are more side characters, but kind of main. It just depends, because wherever you are in the book, that's just kind of who the main characters are. So there's some more characters that come in after that as well. But that's like the main family circuit, I would say. And there's one other character that is not actually part of the family, but is very important, and that is Hanzu. And he is much older than Sunja, but meets Sunja in the market when she was younger, when she was in her teenage years. And this is a big deal because just a lot of things surround this character. He's a very wealthy man. He makes himself be a part of Sunja's life, but on, like, at a distance. He usually only comes and presents himself when he feels necessary. So a lot of time he's in the background, but he's moving things along in her life that she's not aware about. This is just kind of the dynamic that he has, where he kind of just inserts himself when he feels necessary. And she has like a love-hate relationship with him, basically, where there's times where she really cares for him and there's times where she hates him and wishes he would go away. There's times where she needs him. It's all dependent on what's going on in the story. So earlier when I said that Min Jin Lee was really wanting to focus on like the struggle and the real life situations that they were going through during this time, because it spans through the war and then after the war, and some of the time they're in Korea and most of the time they're in Japan. There is definitely a ton of that struggle that you see where they're trying to just make ends meet. They don't have a lot of money and they're really having a hard time. They're all living in one house that's just not super small, but not really the best for as many people that are living there. And so you just go through all these like life stages with them and how they overcome certain struggles, how they continue through some struggles, how they make their lives. And I really enjoyed reading it, and I feel like the story could have just kept going and going and going. Even though it was like 80 years worth, I still feel like there could have been even more. I read a review that somebody didn't like the book because of all the time jumps in it. So it doesn't go like back in time or anything, that kind of a jump. It still goes in order, but sometimes you have this really crazy event that happens, and then the chapter ends, and then it's 5 years later, or the chapter ends and it's 3 years later. And that didn't happen so much at the beginning of the book. When it started to happen, I was like, oh, and I felt kind of sad about it because I was like, well, I really wanted to know what their reaction was for that event right after it happened, not their reactions in hindsight like 5 years later. And so sometimes I wish that there would have been just like a little 5-page chapter in between where it was just a few months later or something before the huge jump went. And I imagine that it's kind of hard to decide which things are most important in a book and where the best time to jump that far forward in the future would be. But for me personally, I wouldn't have minded just having a couple extra pages. Even though I know it's a long book, it still could have had some more pages in there just to fill the gaps a little bit in some instances where I was like, I really want to know what happened right after this, rather than finding out about it later. But other than that, I mean, it still told a really good story. You still get the really important parts, and you still see a full picture of this family and the things that they went through, the things that they overcame. And so it still is really a really good book. So if you are interested in learning more about Sunja and her family, I left a lot of stuff out, especially about Hanzu. He is really an important character, even though he's not exactly family. And so really understanding his role in this, really, without him in this story, it wouldn't really mesh. Like, he's really important. So I just don't want to give so much away as to why he's important. So you should read it so you can find out. Again, thank you so much for watching. That was Pachinko. Check it out. It really is a good book. And yeah, thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.